The morning air felt different that day. Maybe it was the weight of dreams hanging in the atmosphere, or perhaps it was just another Tuesday at the Ashford Music Conservatory. But for 17-year-old Lily, it was the day that would change everything. She sat in the waiting area with dozens of other young pianists, all dressed in their finest concert attire. Black dresses, pressed suits, polished shoes that clicked nervously against the marble floor. The building itself seemed designed to intimidate. High ceilings that made every whisper echo. Walls lined with portraits of famous composers staring down with judgmental eyes, and a massive crystal chandelier that caught the light and scattered it like broken promises. Lily's white cane rested against her chair. Her fingers moved unconsciously on her lap, playing invisible keys, running through the piece she'd practiced 10,000 times. Her mother sat beside her, occasionally reaching over to squeeze her hand. No words were needed. They'd been through this journey together for so many years now. Around them, conversations hummed with nervous energy. Other candidates compared notes about their training, their teachers, the pieces they'd chosen. Some had flown in from different countries. Others had driven through the night. All of them carried the same desperate hope that today would be their breakthrough. "Did you hear Victor Dorsey is judging today?" A boy whispered loudly to his friend. "No way." "The Victor Dorsey? I'm serious. My teacher told me yesterday. He's here as a special guest judge." The waiting room erupted in anxious chatter. Victor Dorsey wasn't just any pianist. He was a legend. His recordings had sold millions. He'd performed in every major concert hall in the world. Critics called him the most technically perfect pianist of his generation. But there was something else people said about him. Something whispered in music schools and practice rooms. He was brutal. His standards were impossibly high. One wrong note, one moment of hesitation, and he would dismiss you entirely. Lily felt her mother's hand tighten. They both knew what this meant. The stakes had just gotten higher. "You don't have to do this today, sweetie," her mother whispered. "We can come back next year when—" "Mom, I'm ready," Lily said softly but firmly. I've been ready, and she had been. Since she was 5 years old, since the accident that took her sight, music had been her world. While other kids were outside playing, she was at the piano. While they were watching television, she was learning new pieces. The piano wasn't just an instrument to her. It was her voice, her eyes, her way of seeing the world. 20 minutes passed. Then an hour. Names were called one by one. Candidates walked through those heavy oak doors leading to the audition hall. Some came back smiling. Most came back fighting tears. This was the reality of professional music. Thousands of talented people competing for a handful of spots. Then the doors opened and everyone fell silent. A man walked through and the air itself seemed to shift. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with silver hair swept back perfectly. He wore an expensive dark suit and carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from decades of applause. Victor Dorsey had arrived. People actually stood up as he passed. Some tried to introduce themselves. He acknowledged no one, his eyes fixed straight ahead as he made his way to the audition hall. Behind him, 2 assistants struggled to keep up, carrying his coffee and briefcase. "Did you see him?" The boy from earlier whispered, his voice full of awe. "He looked right through me," his friend replied. Lily couldn't see any of this, but she could feel it. The way the energy in the room changed, the way people's voices dropped, the way her own heart started beating faster. Another 30 minutes crawled by. More names called. More dreams evaluated and measured in 15-minute intervals. Then finally, the door opened and a woman with a clipboard appeared. "Lily Wang," she called out. Lily stood, taking her cane in one hand. Her mother stood with her, but Lily shook her head gently. "I need to do this part alone, Mom." Her mother's voice cracked just slightly. "I know you do. I'll be right here." Lily walked toward the voice, her cane sweeping the floor in practiced arcs. She'd memorized the layout of this building from the website description. 15 steps to the door. Turn right. 20 steps down the corridor. Another set of doors leading to the stage. Behind her, whispers started immediately. Is she blind? How can she possibly play piano if she can't see? This seems like some kind of publicity thing. Lily heard every word. She'd heard versions of these words her entire life. At first they used to hurt. Now they were just background noise like traffic or rain. The assistant led her onto the stage. Lily could feel the space opening up around her. The auditorium was big. She could tell by the way sounds echoed. Probably 300 or 400 seats, most of them full. She could hear breathing, rustling programs, whispered conversations. The piano is 3 steps ahead and 2 steps to your right, the assistant said kindly. Thank you, Lily replied. She found the piano bench easily. The Steinway grand. She could tell by the feel of the keys under her fingertips as she reached out. She'd practiced on a Steinway before. They had one at her music school. This one was perfectly tuned. She could tell immediately. Lily sat down, adjusted the bench height, and placed her hands gently on the keys. This was home. This was where everything made sense. But before she could begin, a voice cut through the silence. Sharp, cold, dismissive. Is this some kind of joke? The entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. Lily's hands froze on the keys. Excuse me? One of the other judges said. This girl. Is this a publicity stunt? Some kind of inspirational story for the local news? Lily realized with sinking certainty that the voice belonged to Victor Dorsey. Mr. Dorsey, another judge, tried to intervene. Miss Wang is a qualified applicant who— This is the Ashford Music Conservatory, Victor interrupted. Not a charity. We're looking for the next generation of professional musicians. I don't have time for feel-good moments or inspirational gestures. In the audience, Lily heard her mother stand up. She heard the anger in that movement, the sharp scrape of a chair. Lily raised one hand slightly, a signal they'd developed over years. It meant, I've got this. Trust me. The auditorium was so quiet now you could hear the ventilation system humming. May I play, sir? Lily asked. Her voice was calm, steady. Stronger than she felt inside. There was a long pause. Then Victor's voice again, dripping with condescension. By all means. Let's get this over with so we can move on to serious candidates. Lily heard some uncomfortable shifting in the audience. Someone coughed. She imagined the other judges exchanging glances, unsure whether to intervene further. She took a deep breath. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She'd chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most technically demanding pieces ever written. The same piece she'd learned from her research that Victor Dorsey had performed at his legendary debut at Carnegie Hall 30 years ago. If he wanted to dismiss her, she'd make him listen. She'd make them all listen. The first chord was waiting. All she had to do was begin. Lily's hands rested on the keys, but she didn't play. Not yet. She was listening, feeling. The piano beneath her fingers was more than wood and strings and hammers. It was alive in a way most people never understood. In the audience, people shifted uncomfortably. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Victor Dorsey's words still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Publicity stunt. Feel-good moment. Not serious. Each phrase had been designed to wound, and they had found their mark. But something unexpected was happening. The other candidates in the waiting room had heard the commotion. Some had quietly slipped into the back of the auditorium to watch. They'd all experienced rejection before. They all knew what it felt like to be dismissed. And right now, a girl they'd never met was being humiliated on stage, and they couldn't look away. Lily's mother stood near the back doors. Her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She'd spent 17 years watching her daughter face a world that underestimated her at every turn. Teachers who said she'd never read music. Doctors who suggested she find a different hobby. People who spoke louder around her as if being blind also meant being deaf or stupid. But through it all, Lily had never quit, never backed down, and she wasn't about to start now. On stage, Lily finally spoke again. Her voice carried through the auditorium with unexpected strength. Mr. Dorsey, she said, I chose Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 for my audition today. There was a pause. Then Victor's voice, sharp with something that might have been surprise or might have been annoyance. You chose what? The Rachmaninoff. The second concerto. I believe it's one of your signature pieces. Another pause. Longer this time. One of the other judges cleared their throat nervously. Young lady, Victor said, and his tone had changed slightly. There was less dismissiveness now, replaced by something colder, harder. Do you have any idea what you're attempting? That piece requires absolute technical precision, split-second timing, visual coordination that I don't have. Lily finished for him. Yes, sir. I'm aware. Someone in the audience actually gasped. You didn't interrupt Victor Dorsey. You certainly didn't challenge him, but Lily wasn't done. I've been playing piano for 12 years. I've memorized over 200 pieces. I've won regional competitions in 3 states. And I didn't come here today looking for inspiration or sympathy. I came here because I'm good enough. And I'd like the chance to prove it. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was electric, charged with possibility. Victor leaned back in his judge's chair. Lily couldn't see him, but she could feel his gaze on her. Measuring, calculating. For the first time since he'd walked into the room, he actually seemed interested. "Fine," he said finally. "Play, but understand something. I will not grade you on a curve. I will not make allowances. If you miss a note, if your timing is off, if you cannot deliver this piece at a professional level, I will stop you, and I will recommend that you not be admitted to this conservatory. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear," Lily said. She took a deep breath. Her fingers found their starting position. She'd practiced this moment so many times it lived in her muscle memory. The opening of the Rachmaninoff was deceptively simple. Just a few notes. But those notes had to be perfect. They set the tone for everything that followed. In the front row, an elderly woman who taught music theory at the conservatory leaned toward her colleague. "He's setting her up to fail," she whispered. "That piece is brutal even for sighted pianists. The hand coordination alone." "I know," her colleague whispered back. "This is going to be painful to watch." But they were wrong. So wrong. Lily's fingers descended onto the keys and the first notes emerged. Soft, haunting, perfect. The opening bars of Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto are famous for a reason. They sound simple, but they require absolute control. The melody has to float above the accompanying chords like mist over water. Too heavy and it becomes clumsy. Too light and it disappears entirely. Lily played it flawlessly. The elderly music theory professor sat up straighter. Her colleague's eyes went wide. Lily continued into the more complex passages. Her right hand carried the melody while her left hand provided the foundation. The coordination required was extraordinary. Most pianists had to watch their hands constantly during this section. Lily's hands moved with absolute confidence, finding every key exactly where it needed to be. Victor Dorsey's expression hadn't changed, but his posture had. He was leaning forward now, elbows on his knees, watching intently. The piece built in complexity. Runs up and down the keyboard. Chords that required her hands to stretch across multiple octaves. Passages where both hands had to move independently, playing different rhythms, different dynamics, different emotional tones all at once. And Lily never hesitated. Not once. But here's what made it truly remarkable. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was interpreting them, adding her own voice to Rachmaninoff's vision. Where another pianist might have played a passage with technical precision but no soul, Lily added subtle variations in tempo, a slight pause before a particular chord, a gentle emphasis on a melody line that brought out emotional depth most people missed. She played the way people write poetry. Every phrase had meaning. Every rest was purposeful. In the audience, the whispers had completely stopped. People weren't just listening anymore. They were holding their breath. Some had tears forming in their eyes and they didn't even know why yet. Victor Dorsey's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. His jaw was clenched tight. Something was happening behind his eyes. A memory, maybe. Or a realization. 30 years ago, he'd played this exact piece at Carnegie Hall. It had launched his career. Made him famous. But he'd played it differently. He'd played it with mechanical perfection. Every note precisely where it should be. Every timing exactly as written. Critics had called it flawless, but they'd never called it moving. Lily reached the bridge section where the piece shifts from melancholy to something more hopeful. This was the hardest part technically. The hands had to move in opposite directions at different speeds while maintaining perfect balance. Even accomplished pianists sometimes fumbled here. Lily's hands moved like they were having a conversation, dancing together but independent, telling a story that transcended the notes on a page she'd never been able to read. One of the other judges, a woman in her 40s who'd performed with major orchestras around the world, found herself crying. Actually crying. She'd heard this piece hundreds of times. She'd performed it herself. But she'd never heard it played like this. With this much vulnerability, this much truth, the melody soared higher. Lily's whole body moved with the music now, swaying slightly. Her face showed every emotion the piece demanded. Joy, sorrow, longing, hope. She wasn't performing the music. She was living inside it. Victor's hands had moved from the armrest to his face. He was watching through his fingers, and his expression had completely changed. The arrogance was gone. The dismissiveness had vanished. What remained looked almost like pain, because he suddenly understood something that had taken him 3 decades to realize. All his life he'd pursued perfection. Flawless technique, mechanical precision. He'd trained himself to play without error, without emotion, without vulnerability. He'd built a legendary career on being perfect, and this 17-year-old girl who couldn't see the keys was showing him what he'd lost along the way. She was showing him what music was supposed to be. The piece continued building toward its climax. Lily's fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and accuracy. The notes poured out like water, like light, like something beyond language. Every person in that auditorium felt it. In their chest. In their throat. In that place where music touches something deeper than thought. And they knew they were witnessing something rare. Something that doesn't happen often in a lifetime. They were watching someone play not just with skill, but with soul. The music swelled toward its peak. Lily's hands moved faster now, the notes cascading like a waterfall. This was the moment where the piece demanded everything from a pianist. Physical strength, mental focus, emotional courage. The climax of Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto wasn't just difficult. It was a test of who you were as a musician, and Lily was passing that test with flying colors. Her left hand pounded out powerful chords that shook the air while her right hand wove intricate melodies above them. The contrast was stunning, thunder and lightning happening at the same time. The piano itself seemed to come alive under her touch, every string vibrating with purpose. In the 4th row, a man who'd been teaching piano for 35 years leaned over to his wife. His voice barely a whisper. "I've never seen anything like this." His wife nodded, unable to speak. Tears were streaming down her face. The elderly music theory professor in the front row had stopped taking notes. Her pen had fallen from her hand several minutes ago. She was just staring now, her mouth slightly open, watching this impossible thing happening right in front of her, because it shouldn't have been possible. The visual coordination required for this piece was enormous. Pianists needed to see their hands, judge distances, watch for the precise moment to strike each key. That's what everyone believed. That's what they taught in every music school. Lily was proving them all wrong. She navigated the complex passages without a single mistake. Her hands found every key exactly where it needed to be, not through sight, through something deeper, through thousands of hours of practice, through muscle memory so ingrained it was like breathing, through a connection to the instrument that went beyond the physical. Victor Dorsey sat frozen in his chair. His face had gone pale. Behind his eyes, memories were flooding back. Memories he'd buried for decades. He remembered being young, 19 years old, sitting at a piano in a small practice room, his teacher standing behind him, an old German man named Wilhelm who'd studied with some of the great masters. "You play like a machine, Victor," Wilhelm had said. "Perfect notes, perfect timing. But where is your heart? Where is your soul?" Young Victor had been angry. Music is about precision, about discipline. Music is about truth, Wilhelm had interrupted. About showing people who you really are. All your joy, all your pain. Everything you hide from the world you must show at the piano. Otherwise you are just making noise. Victor had left that teacher, found someone else who valued technical perfection, spent years training himself to play flawlessly, building walls around his emotions, becoming the cold, precise pianist that critics praised. And now, 30 years later, a blind 17-year-old girl was doing what he'd never been able to do. She was playing with perfect technique and complete emotional honesty at the same time. She was doing what Wilhelm had begged him to do all those years ago. The piece moved into its final section. The storm began to calm. The powerful chords gave way to something softer, more reflective. This was where the piece asked you to be vulnerable, to let your guard down, to show tenderness after showing strength. Lily's playing became almost whisper quiet. Her touch on the keys was so delicate it seemed impossible that any sound could come out. But it did. Notes that floated into the air like dandelion seeds. Fragile, beautiful, heartbreaking. A young man in the back row, one of the other candidates who'd snuck in to watch, found himself thinking about his own audition. He'd played well, technically sound, but watching Lily, He suddenly understood the difference between playing notes and making music. He'd been so focused on not making mistakes that he'd forgotten to say anything meaningful. The woman sitting next to him was crying openly now. So were dozens of others scattered throughout the auditorium. They couldn't help it. The music was reaching into them and pulling out emotions they didn't know they had. This was the power of real artistry. It didn't just entertain. It transformed. It made you feel things you'd been avoiding. It reminded you of dreams you'd given up on. It showed you beauty in a world that often felt too harsh and cold. Lily approached the final phrases. The piece ended quietly, almost questioning, like someone asking if hope still exists, if love is still real, if any of this matters. Her fingers played the last few notes with such tenderness it hurt. Each note hung in the air for a moment before fading. The melody dissolved like morning mist, and then silence. Complete. Total. Absolute silence. Lily's hands lifted from the keys. She sat still, her head slightly bowed, her breathing steady. She'd given everything she had. There was nothing left to do but wait. The silence stretched on. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. In the audience, people seemed frozen, like they'd been turned to stone by what they'd just witnessed. Then someone started clapping. Just one person at first, the elderly music theory professor in the front row. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly in the quiet, and she clapped. Then another person stood. And another. Within 5 seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet. The applause wasn't polite. It wasn't the kind of clapping you do because you're supposed to. It was thunderous, desperate. Like people were trying to physically express something that words couldn't capture. People were shouting. Bravo, bravo. Some were still crying. Others were hugging strangers next to them. The candidates who'd snuck in from the waiting room were applauding so hard their hands hurt. Lily stood slowly from the piano bench. She bowed, her face showing relief and exhaustion and quiet joy. She'd done it. She'd proven herself. Not to them. To herself. But Victor Dorsey hadn't moved. He sat in his judge's chair, his hands covering his face now. His shoulders were shaking. The other judges glanced at him nervously, unsure what to do. One of them, a kind-looking man in his 60s, reached over to touch Victor's shoulder. "Victor, are you—" Victor's hands dropped from his face, and everyone who could see him gasped. The legendary Victor Dorsey was crying. Actually crying. Tears streamed down his face unchecked. His expression was raw, broken open. All the armor he'd worn for decades had cracked apart. The applause began to fade as people noticed. The auditorium grew quiet again, but this time the silence was different. Confused. Uncertain. Victor stood up suddenly. His chair scraped back. He stepped down from the judge's table and walked onto the stage. His footsteps echoed in the quiet. Everyone watched, holding their breath. Lily stood near the piano, unable to see what was happening. But she could hear footsteps approaching, heavy, purposeful. She straightened her spine, preparing for whatever was coming. Another insult, maybe. Another dismissal. Victor stopped a few feet away from her. When he spoke, his voice was completely different from before. All the coldness was gone. What remained was raw, honest, vulnerable. "Wait," he said. Just that one word at first. Lily turned toward his voice, her expression calm but guarded. Victor took a breath. When he spoke again, his voice carried through the auditorium. Everyone heard every word. 32 years ago, he began, and his voice cracked slightly. I had a teacher, a brilliant man named Wilhelm. He told me I would never be a truly great pianist because I was afraid. Afraid to be vulnerable. Afraid to show weakness. Afraid to let people see the real me. He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I spent my entire career proving him wrong. I became technically perfect, flawless. I built my reputation on never making mistakes. On being cold, precise, untouchable. Another pause. The auditorium was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming. And today, Victor continued, his voice stronger now, you just played my piece, the piece I built my entire career on, the piece I've performed hundreds of times in concert halls around the world. He stepped closer to Lily, close enough that she could feel his presence. And you played it the way it was meant to be played, the way I never could, because you weren't afraid. You weren't protecting yourself. You just told the truth. Lily's face showed confusion, surprise. She hadn't expected this. Victor's voice dropped lower. but the acoustics of the hall carried it to every ear. I humiliated you today, in front of all these people. I dismissed you before you played a single note, and I need you to know something. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. You just taught me more about music in 15 minutes than I've learned in 30 years. The silence in the auditorium was thick enough to touch. Victor Dorsey stood on stage, his face wet with tears, having just admitted something he'd probably never said out loud before. That he'd been wrong. That he'd been hiding. That a 17-year-old girl had just shown him what real music was supposed to sound like. Lily stood perfectly still, her white cane in one hand, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't how she'd imagined this moment. She'd prepared for rejection, for criticism, for being told she wasn't good enough. She hadn't prepared for this. Victor took another step closer. His voice was quieter now, meant just for her, but the acoustics carried it through the hall anyway. I owe you an apology, he said. A real one. Not just for what I said today, but for the mindset behind it. I saw your cane and I made assumptions. I decided before you played a single note that you couldn't possibly be serious, that you were here for attention or sympathy or some kind of statement. He shook his head, looking down at his hands like they belonged to a stranger. But the truth is, I wasn't seeing you. I was seeing my own fear, my own limitations, everything I've spent decades trying to hide. Lily's mother stood at the back of the auditorium, one hand pressed to her mouth. She'd watched her daughter face discrimination and doubt for 17 years. She'd seen teachers who didn't believe, schools that made excuses, people who treated Lily like she was broken or incomplete. But she'd never seen anyone apologize like this. Never seen someone actually admit they were wrong. One of the other judges, the woman who'd been crying during the performance, stood up from the judges' table. She walked onto the stage, her heels clicking against the wood floor. Mr. Dorsey, she said gently, perhaps we should continue this conversation after. No, Victor interrupted, but his tone wasn't harsh, just firm. This needs to be said now, in front of everyone. He turned back to Lily. You asked if you could play. You stood on this stage and asked permission. Even after I tried to humiliate you. You could have walked away. You could have reported me. You could have made a scene. But instead you just asked if you could play. Victor's voice grew stronger, more certain. That takes more courage than I've shown in my entire career. And you're playing. God, you're playing. He ran a hand through his silver hair, looking up at the ceiling like he was trying to find the right words. I've heard that piece performed by some of the greatest pianists in the world. I've performed it myself hundreds of times. But I've never heard it played with that kind of emotional honesty, that kind of vulnerability. You weren't trying to impress anyone. You were just telling the truth, and that's what music is supposed to be. The elderly music theory professor in the front row nodded vigorously, tears still streaming down her face. Several other people in the audience murmured in agreement. Lily finally spoke, her voice steady despite everything. Mr. Dorsey, I appreciate your words. I do. But I didn't come here today to teach anyone a lesson. I came here to audition for this conservatory because I want to be a professional musician, and while I'm glad my playing moved you, I need to know if it was good enough. The simple directness of her question cut through all the emotion. Victor actually laughed, a sound of surprise mixed with respect. Good enough, he repeated. Good enough? He turned to face the audience, then back to the judges' table. That was the finest performance of that piece I've ever heard, including my own. And I'm not just saying that because of the circumstances or because I feel guilty. I'm saying it because it's true. The other judges were nodding now. The kind man in his 60s who'd tried to comfort Victor earlier stood up. I concur, he said loudly. That was extraordinary by any standard. The woman judge who'd walked onto the stage added her voice. I've been judging auditions for 15 years. That was a masterclass. Not just in technique, but in interpretation. The elderly professor couldn't stay quiet any longer. She stood up in the audience and called out, I've been teaching music for 40 years and I've never heard anything like that. Ever. The auditorium erupted in applause again. But this time it felt different. Less about emotion and more about agreement, about recognition. These weren't just touched audience members anymore. These were musicians, teachers, professionals, all confirming what they'd witnessed. Victor held up his hand, asking for quiet. The applause died down. Miss Wang, he said formally, not only should you be admitted to this conservatory, but I would like to personally recommend you for a full scholarship, and I'd like to make another request if you'll allow me." Lily tilted her head slightly, listening. "I'd like permission to study with you," Victor said. The auditorium gasped. Someone actually dropped their program, the sound echoing in the quiet. "I'm sorry, what?" Lily said, certain she'd misheard. Victor's expression was completely serious. "I want to learn from you. How you approach music, how you connect with it. I've spent 30 years building technical perfection, and in the process I lost something essential. You have what I've been missing, and I'd be honored if you'd help me find it again." The other judges looked shocked. One of them leaned over to whisper to another, "Is he serious?" But Victor's face showed he was completely serious. More serious than he'd been about anything in years. Lily stood quietly for a moment, processing. Then a small smile appeared on her face. "Mr. Dorsey, I think you have that backwards. You're one of the greatest pianists alive. I'm just a girl from Seattle who practices a lot." "No," Victor said firmly. "You're a musician who understands what music is supposed to be. And I'm a technician who forgot. There's a difference." He paused, then added, "Besides, the best learning always goes both ways. I can help you refine your technique, handle some of the more demanding classical pieces, and you can remind me what the point of all that technique is supposed to be." Lily's mother couldn't hold back anymore. She walked quickly down the aisle, her shoes clicking rapidly. When she reached the stage, she climbed the side stairs and went straight to her daughter. "Lily," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Baby, this is your decision, but I think he means it." Lily turned toward her mother's voice. "Mom, is this really happening?" Her mother laughed through her tears. "Yes, sweetheart. This is really happening." Lily turned back toward where Victor was standing. "Mr. Dorsey, I have a condition." "Name it," Victor said immediately. "You have to promise to be honest with me. If my playing needs work, you tell me. No special treatment because of what happened today. No going easy on me because you feel guilty. I want to be a real musician, which means I need real criticism." Victor smiled for the first time since entering the auditorium, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Deal," he said. "Though I have to warn you, I'm not known for going easy on people." "Good," Lily said. "Neither is my current teacher." The audience laughed, the tension finally breaking. People started talking excitedly to each other. The other candidates in the back were whispering about what they'd just witnessed. Some were inspired. Others were intimidated. All of them knew they'd seen something remarkable. The kind judge from the table spoke up. "Miss Wang, we'll need to complete some paperwork, but I think it's safe to say you've been accepted to the Ashford Music Conservatory. Congratulations." More applause. But Lily held up her hand. "Thank you. But can I ask something? There are other people auditioning today. People who've been waiting just as long as I have. People who are just as nervous. Can we let them have their chance?" The room fell quiet again. The judge nodded slowly, looking impressed. "Of course. You're absolutely right. Thank you for the reminder." Victor looked at Lily with something like awe. "You just had the biggest moment of your life and you're thinking about other people's auditions?" Lily shrugged. "We're all here for the same reason. Everyone deserves their fair shot." Victor shook his head in wonder. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You're definitely going to teach me a lot." As Lily and her mother left the stage, the entire auditorium stood again. But this time the applause was different. It wasn't just appreciation for her playing. It was respect for who she was as a person. Victor watched her go, then turned to the other judges. "I need to make a phone call," he said. "Cancel my performances for the next 3 months." The woman judge's eyes widened. "Victor, you have concerts booked all over the world. Carnegie Hall, Royal Albert Hall, Sydney Opera House." "I know," Victor said, "but I need time. Time to relearn what I thought I knew. Time to remember why I started playing in the first place." He looked at the piano on the stage. The same piano Lily had just played. Time to find my way back to the music. The elderly professor approached the stage. "Mr. Dorsey, if I may, what you did today took courage. Admitting you were wrong in front of all these people." Victor nodded. "I've been wrong for a long time, Professor. Today was just the first time I admitted it out loud." "Well," she said with a kind smile, "it's never too late to change. Never too late to remember what matters." Victor looked around the auditorium, at the faces of young musicians waiting for their turn, at the judges who'd witnessed his transformation, at the empty stage where something impossible had just happened. "No," he agreed quietly. It's never too late. 6 months later, the Ashford Music Conservatory looked different to Lily. Not that she could see it, but she could feel it. The hallways that had once seemed intimidating now felt like home. The practice rooms where she spent hours every day had become her sanctuary, and the people who'd once whispered about her now greeted her by name. But the biggest change wasn't the building or the people. It was what was happening in Practice Room 7 every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. Victor Dorsey sat at one piano, Lily sat at another, and they were learning from each other. No, Lily said, stopping mid-phrase. You're playing it correctly, but you're not feeling it. Listen. She played the same passage, her hands moving gently over the keys. The notes were identical to what Victor had just played, but somehow they sounded completely different. Warmer, more alive. Victor tried again. This time there was something new in his playing, a softness he hadn't allowed himself in years. Better, Lily said, smiling. You're getting there. Victor laughed, shaking his head. 6 months ago, if someone told me I'd be taking lessons from a teenager, I would have had them removed from the building. And if someone told me I'd be teaching Victor Dorsey how to play piano, I would have thought they were crazy, Lily replied. But that's exactly what was happening. Their arrangement had become the talk of the classical music world. The legendary perfectionist and the blind prodigy, working together. Some people thought it was a publicity stunt. Others called it revolutionary. But for Victor and Lily, it was simply necessary. Victor helped Lily with the technical challenges that still gave her trouble. Complex pieces that required specific hand positions. Classical interpretations that had been lost to time. The business side of being a professional musician. And Lily helped Victor remember why any of it mattered. The video of Lily's audition had gone viral within days. Someone in the audience had recorded it on their phone. Within a week, it had 20 million views. Within a month, 50 million. News outlets around the world picked up the story. The blind girl who silenced her critic. The legendary pianist who broke down in tears. The apology that changed everything. But the real story wasn't the viral moment. It was what happened after. Victor had kept his promise. He'd canceled 3 months of concerts, turned down appearances that would have paid him hundreds of thousands of dollars, and instead he'd worked with Lily. Not as a famous teacher gracing a student with his presence, but as two musicians trying to understand something together. Let me try that Chopin piece again, Victor said, moving to a new composition. He played, and this time there was real emotion in it. Real vulnerability. It wasn't perfect. There were moments where his timing wavered, where he added unexpected pauses, but it was honest. And honesty, Lily had taught him, was more important than perfection. When he finished, Lily was quiet for a moment. That was beautiful, she said finally. That was really, truly beautiful. Victor felt something unfamiliar. Pride that had nothing to do with technical achievement. Pride that came from connecting with something real. Wilhelm would have liked that, he said quietly. Your old teacher? Lily asked. Yeah, I've been thinking about him a lot lately. I treated him terribly, you know. Dismissed everything he tried to teach me because I thought I knew better. Maybe you should reach out to him, Lily suggested. Victor shook his head. He passed away 15 years ago. I never got to tell him he was right. They sat in silence for a moment, just the two of them and 2 pianos in a small practice room. But you're telling him now, Lily said softly. Every time you play with honesty instead of perfection, every time you choose vulnerability over control, you're telling him he was right. Victor's eyes got misty. Even after 6 months, Lily still had a way of cutting straight to the truth. How did you get so wise at 17? He asked. Lily laughed. I'm not wise. I just pay attention. When you can't see, you learn to listen, really listen. Not just to music, but to everything. To what people don't say. To the emotions behind the words. To the truth underneath all the noise. A knock on the door interrupted them. The conservatory director poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, but Lily, there's someone here to see you. Who? Lily asked. Come see for yourself, the director said with a mysterious smile. Lily and Victor exchanged curious glances, then headed out to the main hall. When they arrived, Lily could hear her mother's excited voice. Lily, you're not going to believe this. Mom, what's going on? There's a producer here, from the National Symphony Orchestra. They want you to perform as a guest soloist. Lily's face went pale. They want what? A new voice spoke, deep, professional. Miss Wang, my name is David Chen. I'm the artistic director for the National Symphony. We saw your audition video, and we were moved by your interpretation of the Rachmaninoff. We'd like to invite you to perform it with our orchestra. A full concert, televised nationally. Lily stood frozen. This was beyond anything she'd imagined. Playing with a major orchestra was something she'd dreamed about for years. But not like this. Not so soon. I don't know what to say, she managed. Victor stepped forward. Say yes, Lily turned toward his voice. But I'm not ready. I've only been at the conservatory for 6 months. I still have so much to learn. You'll never feel ready, Victor said gently. Trust me. I've been performing for 30 years and I still get nervous before every concert. But that's not a reason to say no. That's just part of being human. He paused, then added, Besides, you taught me something important. Perfection isn't the goal. Connection is. And you already know how to connect with an audience. I watched you do it in that audition hall. Lily's mother squeezed her hand. It's your choice, sweetheart. No pressure either way. Lily took a deep breath. 6 months ago, she'd walked into an audition hoping just to be accepted. Now she was being offered a chance to perform with one of the best orchestras in the country. It was terrifying, but it was also exactly what she'd been working toward her whole life. Okay, she said finally. Yes, I'll do it. The hall erupted in excitement. Her mother hugged her. The director congratulated her. David Chen started talking about rehearsal schedules and contract details, but Victor just stood back and smiled. Proud, grateful, changed. 3 months later, Lily stood backstage at the Kennedy Center. In 30 minutes, she would walk out on that stage and perform with the National Symphony Orchestra in front of 3,000 people. And millions more watching on television. She was terrified. Victor stood beside her. He'd flown in from London, where he'd been performing his first concert since his transformation. The reviews had been interesting. Some critics praised his new emotional depth. Others complained he'd lost his precision. Victor didn't care anymore. He knew what mattered. You ready? He asked. No, Lily said honestly. I feel like I'm going to throw up. Victor laughed. Good, that means you care. The day you stop being nervous is the day you should worry. What if I mess up? What if I forget a passage? What if... Lily, Victor interrupted gently. Stop. You're not going out there to be perfect. You're going out there to tell the truth, just like you did in that audition. Just play honestly. That's all anyone can ask. Lily nodded, taking deep breaths. A stage manager appeared. 5 minutes, Miss Wang. Victor gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. Remember what you taught me. Music isn't about impressing people. It's about connecting with them. Sharing something real. I'm scared, Lily admitted. I know, Victor said. But you're also ready. More ready than you think. Lily heard the orchestra tuning, heard the murmur of 3,000 people finding their seats, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Then she thought about that day 6 months ago. Standing on a stage while a famous pianist tried to humiliate her, making the choice to play anyway, to show up, to be brave even when she was terrified. She'd done it once. She could do it again. Okay, she said, straightening her spine. Let's do this. She walked onto the stage, her cane sweeping ahead of her, and the audience applauded. She found the piano, sat down, adjusted the bench. The conductor raised his baton, and Lily began to play. The music that poured out that night wasn't perfect. There were small mistakes, tiny moments where her timing was slightly off. But nobody cared, because what they heard was honest, real, true. They heard a young woman sharing her heart with the world. They heard courage and vulnerability and hope. They heard everything music was supposed to be. In the audience, Victor Dorsey sat in the front row. Tears streamed down his face again. But this time they were tears of pure joy, because he was watching someone he'd once dismissed show the world what real artistry looked like. And he was grateful. Grateful that he'd been wrong. Grateful that she'd been brave enough to prove it. Grateful that he'd been given a second chance to remember what mattered. When Lily finished, the audience didn't just applaud. They roared. They stood. They cheered until their voices were hoarse, and backstage after it was all over, Lily's mother hugged her tight. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. Thanks, Mom, Lily said. But I think I need to sit down. My hands are shaking. They both laughed. And in that moment, everything was perfect. Not because there were no mistakes, but because there was truth, connection, love. And in the end, that was all that really mattered.